On a Wednesday evening in March 2006, a congregation in Selmer, Tennessee, waited for a minister who was never late. 10 minutes passed, then half an hour, then an hour. Finally, the church elders walked to his house to see what was wrong. They found Matthew Winkler dead on his bedroom floor, shot in the back. His wife and 3 little girls were gone, and the search that began that night was, for a day and a half, a search for victims. Selmer sits in the southwestern corner of Tennessee, about 80 miles east of Memphis, the kind of place where a missing preacher is noticed within the hour. The 4th Street Church of Christ anchored much of the town's life, and Matthew Winkler, 31, was its pulpit minister. When the men who came looking for him found his body, the case began, in the words of the investigator who worked the scene, as a mystery.
Members of the 4th Street Church of Christ find their beloved minister, Matthew Winkler, dead in his home.
Nothing was out of place. It wasn't ransacked, looking for valuables. But what would stand out is when you got to the back bedroom.
There were blood stains on the pillows, on the floor.
Matthew was laying beside the bed, and that's where he was found.
You have someone fatally wounded. No one else is around. Is this some type of robbery that had turned into murder?
Was this a vendetta or was it a kidnapping? And it just went wrong.
At that point, you don't know?
You don't know. I mean, it's a mystery.
Mary Winkler and the couple's 3 daughters, 8-year-old Patricia, 6-year-old Mary Alice, called Allie, and 1-year-old Brianna, were nowhere to be found, and neither was the family's minivan. The bedroom telephone, investigators noted, lay unplugged on the floor near the body. None of the children's rooms had been disturbed. Nothing was thrown or broken. Everything in the house looked ordinary, and the children were simply gone. An Amber Alert went out across the country. For the moment, this was the story of a family in peril. It would not stay that way. To understand the weight this death carried, you have to understand what the Winkler name meant. Matthew Brian Winkler was born in November 1974 into a family where preaching was nearly an inheritance. His father, Dan, was a minister. His grandfather, Wendell Winkler, had been a nationally known evangelist who preached for more than half a century. By the family's own account, Matthew was a 4th-generation preacher, raised across Tennessee and Alabama in the rhythms of the Church of Christ. He was tall, athletic, a former high school football player, and by the accounts of those who sat in his pews, magnetic in the pulpit. People said there was no danger of dozing through one of his sermons. When his new congregation in Selmer described what they had been hoping for in a minister, the phrases were almost reverent. He pulled everyone together, one member said. He was, she said, exactly what they needed. He met Mary Carol Freeland at Freed-Hardeman University, a Church of Christ school in Henderson, Tennessee. They married in 1996. He was 21, she was 22. Mary dropped out of college to help pay for Matthew's education. Those who knew her remembered her as outgoing in her youth. Her upbringing had been as strict and church-centered as Matthew's, and the young marriage was patterned the same way, built around the conviction common in their church that the husband is the head of the home. Their first daughter, Patricia, was born in 1997, named for a sister Mary had lost as a child. Allie followed in 1999, and Brianna in early 2005. As Matthew's standing rose, youth minister in McMinnville, then lead minister in Selmer, the family looked from the outside like a portrait of what their world admired. That outside view is precisely the thing this case would spend a year taking apart. The final week of Matthew Winkler's life looked, in hindsight, entirely unremarkable. On Sunday, March 19th, he preached a sermon that was well received. On Tuesday, March 21st, Mary worked as a substitute teacher. That evening, Matthew rented a movie for their daughters. These are the small, ordinary acts that fill a household's days and pass without notice, until they become the last of their kind. What the church elders found the next evening turned a missing persons fear into a homicide. Matthew had been shot once in the back with a 12-gauge shotgun as he lay in bed. The blast drove dozens of pellets into his body. Accounts placed the number at 77, breaking his spine and damaging internal organs. He had rolled, or fallen, from the bed to the floor. He was not, investigators came to believe, killed instantly. One detail from the scene would shadow the entire case. The bedroom telephone lay several feet from Matthew's body, unplugged from its cord. To the police, the implication was grim, that the phone had been disconnected so a wounded man could not call for help. The state medical examiner would say only that it would have taken Matthew a finite amount of time to die. No one in the house used the phone to summon aid, and that single fact would be argued over by both sides for the rest of the case. While Selmer absorbed the news, the search widened across state lines. It ended the following day in Orange Beach, Alabama, a Gulf Coast resort town hundreds of miles from home. An alert officer spotted the family's minivan. Police, still treating this as a possible kidnapping, conducted what they called a felony traffic stop, ordering the driver out, hands up, to walk backward toward them. The driver was Mary Winkler. The 3 girls were unharmed. The officers who made the stop were struck by how composed she was. One later said she seemed almost to be expecting them, that she stepped out without a word and with a blank look on her face. When they searched the van, they found a shotgun in the back. In that moment, the woman they had been treating as a potential victim became a suspect in her husband's death. The girls were turned over to child services. Mary was handcuffed, read her rights, and taken to the station. What had happened in the 2 days between the shooting and the stop would become, in Mary's telling, an act of motherhood. She had taken her daughters to the beach. According to investigators recounting her words, she said she knew her days with them were numbered, and she wanted to give them happy days before the bad ones came. A few hours after the arrest, a Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agent named Stan Stabler sat down with Mary for an interview that ran just over an hour and was captured on audio tape. The agent later said he was struck by her calm, that she did not seem traumatized by what had happened. On that tape, Mary at first protected her husband's memory, even as she began to describe the morning he died. She said she had accepted abuse like a mouse for years, and then, in the phrase that would follow her everywhere, that her ugly came out.
I was upset at him because he'd really been on me lately, criticizing me for things, the way I walk, the way I eat, everything. It was just building up to this point. I was just tired of it. I guess I got to a point and snapped.
By the agent's account, Mary acknowledged shooting Matthew once. She said she thought the gun would kick harder than it did, that she heard a loud boom, and that he rolled out of the bed onto the floor. She was driven back to Selmer that Friday, signed a written statement, and was charged. She turned temporary custody of her daughters over to Matthew's parents, Dan and Diane Winkler. A grand jury would indict her for first-degree murder. Whether what she gave that night was a confession to a planned killing or the disoriented account of a woman in crisis would become the central fight of the trial. Both sides would play that same tape and hear 2 entirely different things in it. The day after she was charged, Mary had an unexpected visitor in her jail cell, a Mississippi defense attorney named Steve Farisi. He recruited a well-known Memphis lawyer, Leslie Ballin. By Ballin's own telling, when he learned the case would be handled for free, he thought his phone had cut out. Farisi told him it was the right thing to do. The entire defense team would represent Mary without charge throughout the criminal case. On the other side stood Michael Dunavant, at 36 the youngest district attorney in state history, elected only months before. He handed the courtroom work to his most seasoned assistant, Walt Freeland. Mary made bond, set at $750,000, in August 2006, and was released to live with the Church of Christ family in McMinnville until trial. The prosecution believed it had a strong case for premeditation. The defense believed it had something the prosecution could not see, the inside of a marriage. When the trial opened in April 2007, the prosecution offered a motive as old as commerce. In the months before Matthew's death, the Winkler finances had collapsed into something close to chaos, and the state argued that Mary was at the center of it. It had begun, prosecutors said, in late 2005, when a check for thousands of dollars arrived at the cash-strapped Winkler home, part of a fraudulent lottery scheme, a swindle of the kind sometimes called the Nigerian scam. Instead of discarding it, Mary deposited it and spent the money, and the check bounced. To cover the loss, the state said, she dug deeper. She diverted the family's mail to a post office box, opened an out-of-town account, and was soon moving worthless checks between several banks faster than they could catch up. It is a crime called check kiting, and the checks, the state emphasized, were signed by Mary, not Matthew. In the final days before the shooting, prosecutors said the pressure spiked. Mary made a flurry of transfers between accounts, and on the day she worked as a substitute teacher, a colleague saw her pacing her classroom on the phone, upset. The state's account was that the bank was closing in, demanding she come in to explain the bounced checks and bring her husband. The deadline, prosecutors said, fell on March 22nd. To Donovan, the logic was plain. Facing exposure in front of the husband whose reputation as a Church of Christ minister depended on appearances, Mary chose murder over divorce. The state walked the jury through the unplugged telephone, a firearms expert who testified the shotgun was in working order and would not fire without a trigger pull, and the full hour and 5-minute tape. Then it rested its case with the witness no one would forget. Prosecutors called the Winkler's oldest daughter, Patricia, then 9 years old. The judge ordered the courtroom cameras turned off. She walked to the stand in a black and white polka dot dress, composed beyond her years, until the prosecutor asked her birthday, and she broke down. She had been one room away the morning her father died.
The girl, dressed in a black and white polka dot dress, said she and her sisters were startled awake by a big boom or something on the morning of the slaying. She said she crept into her parents' bedroom and found her father on the floor groaning. Prosecutor Freeland asked whether Matthew had been a good father, and the child softly replied, "Yes, sir." Asked whether he'd ever been ugly with her mother, she responded, "No, sir."
It was testimony that cut directly against the case the defense was about to make. And then, under questioning from her mother's own attorney, the 9-year-old was asked why, after a single visit, she'd stopped seeing Mary following her release from jail. She said it was because she didn't want to. After a long pause, she added that she still loved her, and dissolved into tears. Mary wept. Several jurors wept. The defense attorney walked to the stand to comfort the child and asked nothing more. The contradiction at the heart of the case now had a face. A daughter who loved her mother, who had seen no abuse, and who could not say why she no longer wanted to see her. The defense opened with a single idea, that the marriage everyone admired had a hidden interior. Mary Winkler appeared to have a marriage made in heaven. Behind closed doors, they said it was a living hell. What followed was the defense's account, much of it drawn from Mary's own statements to a psychologist, and later from Mary herself. Some of it was corroborated by witnesses. Much of it was not, and the prosecution disputed it vigorously. The jury was being asked to weigh claims that, by their nature, had largely played out where no one else could see. The defense called witnesses to chip at Matthew's public image. Mary's sister testified that he controlled what Mary did and isolated her from her family, that a once bubbly sister had become subdued and hard to reach. A highway patrolman described Matthew losing his temper over a barking dog, shouting and waving his arms. A separate report noted Matthew had repeatedly threatened to shoot a neighbor family's dog. A church member testified he had once seen Mary with a black eye and described watching her go silent and shrink the instant Matthew entered a room. None of this was physical proof of abuse, and the prosecution would stress in closing that there was no medical record of it. Mary, the defense answered, had been too ashamed to ever tell anyone. The defense's case for what happened that morning rested heavily on a forensic psychologist, Dr. Lynn Zager. She testified that Mary's troubles began at 13, when her younger sister died and her deeply religious family steered her away from a school counselor's help. The start, Zager said, of serious and untreated mental health problems, including post-traumatic stress disorder. That condition, the psychologist testified, left Mary especially vulnerable and prone in moments of crisis to dissociative episodes, a state she described as stepping outside oneself, as being in a fog. In her professional opinion, Mary had not been capable, that morning, of forming the intent to commit a crime. What had pushed Mary into that fog, the defense argued, was something that happened in the early hours of March 22nd. By Mary's account, relayed through Zager and later from the stand, the baby was crying, and Matthew tried to silence her by covering her nose and mouth, something Mary said he had done with the older girls as infants. Afterward, Zager testified, Mary said she went to the kitchen to make coffee, just like a normal day. The prosecution would seize on that phrase. A woman who could remember making coffee, they argued, was not a woman lost in a fog. Then Mary Winkler took the stand in her own defense, and the trial turned. In a soft southern voice, she described a marriage in which, she said, abuse began within months, being pushed down, struck with a belt, kicked. She testified that Matthew threatened her with the shotgun, telling her, she said, that if she ever talked back, he would cut her into 1,000,000 pieces. She said he had refused her a divorce, which, in their church, carried deep stigma and could have ended his career. And then came the moment the courtroom would remember. At her attorney's prompting, Mary opened a paper sack and drew out a platform high heel and a wig. She testified that Matthew had bought them, that he had wanted her to wear them, and, when pressed, that it was for sex. The defense told the jury that shoes like it appeared in pornography found on Matthew's computer, and Mary testified he had pressured her into acts she considered unnatural and degrading. For a conservative Church of Christ audience, the allegations against a beloved minister landed with physical force. There was, by multiple accounts, an audible gasp. On the central question, whether she meant to kill him, Mary's answer was that she did not remember. She said she had only wanted to talk to him, to make him stop being so mean. She did not remember getting the gun, she testified, and did not remember pulling the trigger. She remembered a sound, a boom, and then running. Asked directly whether she had intentionally killed her husband, she said no. Asked whether she still loved him, even after everything she had described, she said yes. The prosecution was unconvinced, and its cross-examination pressed on the convenient borders of Mary's memory. The assistant district attorney pointed out that she could recall Matthew covering the baby's face and recall going to make coffee, but not the act in between, not how the shotgun came to fire into her husband's back. The state reminded jurors that there was no medical evidence of the abuse she described, that the daughter who lived in the house had seen none, and that her courtroom account differed from what she first told investigators. The notion of an accidental shooting, prosecutors said, was ludicrous. A woman had fired a shotgun into a sleeping man's back and then driven away while he died. The defense, in closing, conceded only the narrowest possible ground. The lead attorney told the jury the state had not proven intent to kill, and, pressed by his own argument toward what she might be guilty of, allowed that perhaps she had been negligent. And he offered the line that captured his entire theory of the case: that if you looked up spousal abuse in the dictionary, you would see Mary Winkler's picture looking back at you.
Well, I think the defense has done a great job of creating this sympathetic impression of their client, which is exactly what they're supposed to do, and getting her to be remorseful at an early stage of the proceedings. But they are glossing over a lot of information in this case. I mean, we're all assuming that Mary Winkler is this wonderful person. However, did she get the gun from the closet? Did she load the gun? What was the last thing that her husband said to her before she shot him? We're glossing over a lot of premeditation here and jumping to the conclusion that Mary Winkler is a very sympathetic character when in fact she could be a cold-blooded killer. What did she do after the shooting? Did she call the police? Was the car loaded and ready to go? I think we're making a leap of faith here to say that Mary Winkler is this sympathetic, wonderful person. She shot somebody in the back.
The jury of 10 women and 2 men received 5 possible verdicts, ranging from first-degree murder, which carried life, down to criminally negligent homicide, which could mean as little as a year. What the jurors were not told was that a conviction for first- or second-degree murder would permanently strip Mary of any right to her daughters. They deliberated for about 8 hours. On April 19th, 2007, they returned a verdict in the middle of their 5 choices: voluntary manslaughter.
There was some that didn't feel like she should get anything. They were ready to let her walk. They felt like he deserved what he got. And then you had some that was like, yes, she was abused, but she did take a life, and that she should get something out of it.
We were very stressed during that time because we didn't know how to work it out.
So it got heated in the
It
jury
did.
room.
Very much so.
I hear that you got frustrated because one of the jurors wouldn't even admit that she pulled the trigger.
Yes.
Refused to believe it.
And I looked at her and I was like, what?
Would this jury have allowed Mary to walk free?
Part of them would have. They felt like she had already lived through prison with the life that she lived, and that it was justified and that she deserved to be free.
That's why you compromised and agreed to the lesser charge?
Yes, because I didn't want her to walk.
By her lawyer's account, Mary's first question on hearing the verdict was whether it meant she could get her children back. Jurors later said they could not agree on whether the gun could have fired by accident, but that they had been moved by the psychologist and by the allegations of sexual coercion. The sentence, handed down that June, stunned the country. Mary was sentenced to 3 years, but the judge ordered her to serve only 210 days, with credit for time already served and up to 60 of the remaining days in a mental health facility. In the end, beyond what she had already served, she would spend roughly 2 months in psychiatric treatment and a matter of days in jail. What followed the trial was not resolution, but a second, quieter war. Over 3 little girls. Matthew's parents, Dan and Diane Winkler, who had cared for the daughters since the arrest, moved to terminate Mary's parental rights and adopt them, and filed a multi-million-dollar wrongful death suit against her. Tennessee law allows a court to terminate the rights of a parent convicted of the intentional and wrongful death of the child's other parent. But the manslaughter verdict, and the abuse the jury had evidently credited, complicated that path. Mary was granted supervised visitation, then lost it on appeal, then had it reinstated. The fight reached the Tennessee Supreme Court, which rejected the grandparents' efforts to block her visits. The legal back-and-forth ground on for 2 years. Then, in August 2008, the 2 sides reached an agreement, and Mary regained custody of her daughters.
A woman convicted of shooting her minister husband to death has been granted custody of her children. 34-year-old Mary Winkler will regain the right to care for her 3 daughters, now 3, 9, and 11 years old. Winkler was convicted of voluntary manslaughter last year in the 2006 killing. During her trial, Winkler testified that she suffered years of physical and emotional abuse by her husband, 31-year-old Matthew Winkler. The grandparents had tried to block Winkler's visits with their children. The case made it all the way to Tennessee Supreme Court, which rejected their effort.
It was, by any measure, an extraordinary outcome. A woman who had killed her children's father, raising those children again within 2 years. The grandparents retained visitation. 2 families bound by a marriage and broken by a death now had to find a way to share the children left in the middle. In the years after, Mary Winkler tried to live quietly. She settled in Tennessee, raised her daughters, and was later diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. In a rare interview, she spoke not of the killing, but of wanting her girls judged for who they were, rather than for what their mother had done. Remarkably, she said that during a health crisis, Matthew's parents, the people who had fought her in court for the children, had stepped in to care for the girls. What this case never produced was certainty. The prosecutor insisted to the end that the evidence pointed to premeditation. a woman cornered by her own financial crimes who killed to keep the secret. The defense insisted, just as firmly, that a battered woman had finally broken under years of cruelty no outsider had seen. Both cannot be wholly true, and the only person who knew the whole of it has never told it the same way twice. A 9-year-old testified she never saw her father hurt her mother. A jury looked at a wig and a high heel and heard enough doubt to spare a woman the rest of her life in prison. What is left is harder to name. A 31-year-old minister is dead, shot in the back in the home where his daughters slept. 3 girls grew up having lost their father to the hand of their mother, and were then returned to that mother to be raised. Whatever the truth of that marriage was, it ended with a single shotgun blast in the dark, and everyone left behind has spent the years since living with a story that was never allowed to fully resolve.